A recent study published in the prestigious scientific journal Nature has uncovered some fascinating insights about our body's response to cold exposure. We have been told that trying to remain calm and resisting shivering when exposed to cold water or an ice bath is the best way to adapt to the cold. However, this new study suggests that shivering itself is what triggers the increase in brown fat thermogenesis and metabolism. Stay till the end to find out how you can promote fat loss through shivering. Brown fat is a type of adipose tissue that generates heat by burning calories, also known as good fat, because it helps to regulate body temperature and boosts metabolism, which in turn helps to burn excess fat. The study found that shivering causes small movement in the muscles, which stimulate the release of a molecule called succinate. This molecule in turn activates the production of brown fat, leading to an increase in thermogenesis and metabolism. Before you jump into an ice bath and start shivering, it's essential to know that this mechanism is not foolproof. The study also found that trying to resist shivering could short-circuit this mechanism, reducing the amount of brown fat produced.
If you get into cold water or an ice bath or a cold day, and you try and remain calm and resist shivering, you actually short-circuit this mechanism for increasing brown fat thermogenesis. The paper published in Nature shows that it is shivering itself that causes the brown fat to increase your burn rate and your metabolism. And it works like this. When you get into cold and you shiver, the shivering, that low-level movement of the muscle, those small movements, triggers the release of a molecule called succinate, succinate, succinate. And succinate acts on the brown fat to increase brown fat thermogenesis and fat burning overall. It actually increases body heat through this brown fat thermogenesis pathway. And it also, over time, can increase the amount of brown fat by converting beige fat into true brown fat. Now, how much cold exposure and how often, that's the key. But before I give that detail or set of details, remember, if you resist the shiver, you are not going to get the increased metabolic effect because you are not going to get the succinate release. So if you want to get your body heat, your thermogenic level to go up, you need to shiver.
Succinate is a substance that has the potential to increase brown fat thermogenesis and promote fat burning in the body. By activating brown fat, succinate can generate heat and increase metabolism, leading to a greater calorie burn. However, the benefits of succinate can only be achieved through cold exposure and shivering. It is important to note that resisting the shiver will prevent the release of succinate and hinder thermogenic effect. To fully harness the potential of succinate, individuals should aim to incorporate regular cold exposure and shivering into their routine. The optimal frequency and duration of cold exposure will vary depending on individual factors, but it is important to prioritize consistency to see the desired effects. If you're wondering how long you should stay in a cold environment to trigger weight loss, beware that the answer to this question isn't as straightforward as you might think.
So first, let's talk about how long to get into that cold environment. The answer here might be a little bit different than you might imagine. Most of you might think, oh, well, if 1 minute is good, 3 minutes is better, and if 3 minutes is better, then 10 minutes is best. But remember, the goal is to get the shiver-induced release of succinate so that succinate can trigger the brown fat. It turns out that if you want to trigger the shiver, what you want to do is to get into the cold and then get out of the cold, and typically not dry off, and then get back into the cold and out of the cold. That will definitely stimulate more shivering than just getting into the cold itself. So what I'm not referring to is getting into the cold environment like an ice bath and waiting until you shiver and staying there shivering, okay? You also don't want to get hypothermic, and I want to be clear, you want to get approval from your doctor before you do any of this.
Many people assume that the longer you stay in the cold, the better the results. The key to triggering the shiver-induced release of succinate is to get in and out of the cold repeatedly without drying off in between. This will stimulate more shivering, which in turn triggers brown fat to burn calories. However, it's important to note that this doesn't mean staying in the cold until you start shivering and risking hypothermia. Before trying cold exposure, make sure to consult with your doctor. The two main factors that determine whether or not you shiver when entering cold water are the temperature of the water and your personal cold tolerance.
When you get into cold water, there are two factors that will dictate whether or not you shiver, probably three, but let's just talk about the main two. One is how cold it is. So how cold should it be? And look, if you get into water that's very, very cold, it can actually shock your heart. It can actually give you a heart attack if it's truly, truly ice cold and you're not adapted to that. So proceed with caution, please. I'm not a physician and I don't want to see anyone get hurt. Cold, just cold enough to be uncomfortable is a good place to start. So for some of you, that's going to be 60 degrees. For some of you, that's going to be 55 degrees. For some of you, it's going to be high 30s, right? Depends on how cold adapted you are, and people vary in terms of how well they tolerate the cold. So what you need to do is find a temperature that you can get into 1 to 5, probably 1 to 3 times a week if you really want this to accelerate fat loss. And you want to get in until you just start to shiver, and then you want to get out and not dry off. Wait anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes and then get back into the cold.
It's important to find a temperature that is uncomfortable but not dangerous, as extremely cold water can shock your heart and cause alarm. The ideal temperature varies for each person and depends on their level of cold adaptation. It's recommended to start with a temperature that you can tolerate and gradually decrease it as you become more adapted to the cold. To stimulate fat loss, you should enter the cold water until you start shivering, then exit without drying off, wait a few minutes, and repeat the process. The method of accessing cold does not matter as long as you trigger shivering by moving from a cold environment to a slightly warmer one. The process of cooling and rewarming, rather than staying in the cold for an extended time, is what triggers shivering. For example, people who regularly expose themselves to cold, such as those who swim in cold water, may not necessarily lean despite the high level of cold exposure. This is because the body adapts to the cold, and over time, the release of epinephrine and adrenaline in response to the cold diminishes. As a result, the succinate release and subsequent shivering and thermogenic effect of brown fat are not as intense. If the goal is to increase fat loss through cold exposure, the key is to trigger the shivering process through the cooling and rewarming of the body. This process accelerates the amount of shivering and, as a result, increases the thermogenic effect of brown fat. While cold exposure can be used for various purposes, those looking to increase fat loss should focus on triggering shivering through the cooling and rewarming process. What are your thoughts on all of this? Let us know in the comment section. If you found this video interesting or helpful, don't forget to like it, subscribe, and press the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future uploads. Until then, take care.